January 15th, 1943. In a city buried under snow and smoke, a German officer takes a small piece of paper from his coat. His hands tremble, not from fear, but from the cold that has sunk deep into his bones. The temperature outside is minus 30 degrees Celsius. Around him, the once mighty Sixth Army, 300,000 men who marched across the steppe in summer, is dying one by one. He begins to write. The ink freezes on the nib, spreading in slow, uneven lines. Each word becomes a farewell, not just to a family far away, but to a world that no longer exists. 6 months earlier, no one in the German High Command believed such a moment could ever happen. In the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht had seemed unstoppable. After their failure before Moscow, Hitler's armies had regrouped, refitted, and turned south. Their new objective, the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city that bore the Soviet leader's name, Stalingrad. To the German generals, it was supposed to be a swift strike, a blow that would cut the Soviet Union in half and cripple its war machine. They called it Operation Blue. In Berlin, the newspapers spoke of victory before the battle had even begun. But on the banks of the Volga, the Red Army stood waiting. When the first German bombs fell on Stalingrad in August 1942, the city vanished in fire. Whole districts burned to ash. Yet even as the Luftwaffe turned the skyline into ruin, the Soviet defenders refused to abandon it. Stalin's order was clear: not one step back. Every street, every building, every basement became a fortress. The Germans advanced through rubble, fighting house to house, floor by floor. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in meters. The officer whose letter would one day be found in the ruins of Stalingrad had arrived with one of those early assault waves. He was young, barely 30, a veteran of campaigns in France and Poland. In his first letters home, his tone was confident. He described the advance as unstoppable, the enemy as broken. "It will be over by Christmas," he wrote in September. But Christmas came, and Stalingrad still stood. By November, the balance had changed. The Soviets, having built their strength in the shadows, launched their counterattack. Operation Uranus. From the frozen steppes north and south of the city, they struck the German flanks held by Romanian and Italian divisions. Within days, the trap closed. The Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was surrounded. Inside the encirclement, the Kessel, as the soldiers called it, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Food rations dropped to a few hundred grams of bread a day. Ammunition ran out. Horses were slaughtered for meat. The wounded froze to death in cellars that had once been schools and factories. Still, orders from Hitler were clear. The Sixth Army will hold its ground. The officer kept writing home. His tone changed. In December, his words carried no more illusions of victory. "The cold is everywhere," he wrote. "It enters the lungs like glass. We burn anything that will burn. Even the furniture, even our maps. We no longer fight for conquest. We fight to stay alive." By January 1943, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a tomb. The German lines had shrunk into a few shattered blocks near the tractor factory in the airfield at Potomnik. Supplies could no longer reach them. The Luftwaffe's air bridge, promised to sustain the encircled army, was collapsing. Fewer and fewer planes arrived each day, and those that did were shot down or returned empty. In one of his final letters, the officer described the silence between shellings. "The kind of silence," he wrote, "that feels heavier than the explosions themselves." He spoke of comrades buried in snow, of men who no longer spoke, only stared, of how time itself seemed frozen, each hour the same as the last. And still he tried to sound brave. "We are proud to have stood so long," he ended one note. "If we cannot return, remember us as soldiers who did their duty." That letter, written on January 15, 1943, would never reach its destination. It was found months later by Soviet soldiers, sealed inside a tin case near the officer's body. His handwriting had faded, but the words survived, a fragile echo of a generation that believed itself invincible. When he wrote that letter, the Sixth Army still numbered nearly 100,000 men. 2 weeks later, half of them were gone. The snow kept falling, and somewhere in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, The last flicker of the German dream of conquest died, quietly in the dark, beneath the sound of wind and distant guns. January 16th, 1943. The morning after the officer wrote his final letter, the city of Stalingrad awoke to a silence broken only by the distant thud of artillery. The sun never rose that day, not truly. It was a dim gray light that filtered through the smoke, barely touching the ground. Inside the ruins, the men of the Sixth Army waited. They were no longer an army. They were a collection of isolated groups, clinging to pockets of resistance, starving and frozen. In the command posts, officers stared at maps that no longer meant anything. The front lines had dissolved. Streets marked as defensive sectors were already gone, buried under snow and rubble. The radio messages from headquarters had stopped coming. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies. The airfields at Pitomnik and Gumrak, the lifelines to the outside world, were under Soviet artillery fire. Each night, men looked to the sky for planes that would never come. The Sixth Army had once been Hitler's pride, the spearhead of his 1942 campaign to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. Its commander, General Friedrich Paulus, was a man known for his precision, his discipline, his loyalty. But in January 1943, even he knew the truth. The battle was lost. Still, he hesitated. His orders from Hitler were absolute. Not one step backward. The Führer had promised relief, new divisions, new supplies. None of it came, and yet Paulus could not disobey. He had risen through the ranks by following orders. To question them now, even as his men starved, was unthinkable. In his diary, one of Paulus's staff officers wrote, "We have no food, no fuel, and no faith, but still we wait for orders." The men in the trenches and cellars no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of home, of mothers and wives, of warm rooms and bread. They spoke of everything that seemed impossibly far away. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes. Disease spread through the ranks. The wounded begged for morphine that no longer existed. One sergeant recalled in his final notes, "We no longer fight the Russians. We fight hunger, the cold, and the end of reason." The Soviets, on the other side of the ruins, could hear the desperation. They sent leaflets by the thousands over German positions, urging surrender. "You are surrounded," they read. "Your commanders cannot save you. Lay down your arms and live." Some men burned the leaflets. Others kept them, not for propaganda, but because they made good fuel. By January 20th, Paulus's headquarters received the last radio message from outside the pocket. It came from Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, leading the relief forces far to the west. His message was short. The attempt to break through had failed. There would be no rescue. The men in Stalingrad understood. They were on their own. In the following days, the Soviet encirclement tightened like a vice. The Red Army, under the command of Generals Rokossovsky, Yeremenko, and Shwikov, advanced block by block, reducing the German perimeter to a fraction of its former size. Soviet tanks crushed the snow-covered streets, their guns firing point-blank into basements and bunkers. Still, small groups of Germans fought back. They had no hope of survival, only the instinct to hold their ground. The officer who had written his final letter would have been among them. His position, near the tractor factory, was one of the last to fall. Witnesses described the area as a frozen wasteland of iron and corpses. By January 25th, only one airfield remained, Gumrak. It fell that night. After that, there was no escape. The Sixth Army, once 300,000 strong, was now cut into two pockets, the northern and southern halves of the ruined city. Paulus remained in the southern sector, surrounded by the remnants of his staff. He continued to send reports to Hitler, signing them Heil mein Führer, even as his command collapsed. In one of his last transmissions, he wrote, "The men have done their duty to the last. The end is near. The suffering is beyond description." Hitler's reply was cold, almost detached. He forbade surrender, insisting that Paulus fight to the last man. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. No German field marshal, Hitler reminded him, had ever surrendered. The message was clear: die or obey. But Paulus did not die. At dawn on January 31st, Soviet troops reached the cellars of the Univermag department store, where Paulus had set up his command post. He refused to meet them at first, sitting motionless at a small table. When the Soviet officers entered, they found a man who looked more like a ghost than a general. His uniform was immaculate, his face pale, his voice quiet. He surrendered without ceremony. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist. Of the 300,000 men who had entered Stalingrad, fewer than 100,000 were taken prisoner. Of those, only around 5,000 would ever return to Germany. In the days that followed, Soviet soldiers searched the ruins. They found diaries, letters, and photographs, the last traces of an army that had once believed it could conquer the world. Among them was the letter written on January 15, now frozen to the officer's chest. The ink had not faded. The final line read, "I do not regret what I have done. I only regret that I will never see the spring again." He had died the next day. For the men of the Sixth Army, there was no spring, only snow, silence, and the knowledge that the war they had once believed unstoppable had turned against them. Stalingrad was over, but its shadow would stretch across all of Europe. February 1943. The city of Stalingrad lay in ruins. Smoke hung low over the Volga, mingling with the bitter cold. The last gunfire had fallen silent, replaced by the creak of ice shifting on the river and the distant cries of scavenging crows. What had once been a city of factories and workers was now a landscape of twisted steel and frozen bodies. For the Soviet Union, victory had come at a cost beyond comprehension. The Red Army had lost over 1 million men, killed, wounded, or missing. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. Civilians who had survived the siege emerged from cellars like ghosts, starving, trembling, half-mad from months of hunger and shelling. But they had endured. They had done what no one in the world believed possible. They had stopped the German war machine. The fall of Stalingrad was more than a military defeat for Germany. It was a fracture, a psychological wound that reached from the front lines to the heart of Berlin. For the first time, Hitler's voice trembled when he addressed his people. For the first time, his generals spoke openly of doubt. The myth of invincibility, the belief that the German army could never be beaten, had died on the banks of the Volga. In Berlin, the Ministry of Propaganda struggled to contain the truth. Goebbels called it a tragic setback, not a catastrophe. Newspapers printed maps that still showed the Eastern Front intact. But across Germany, families began to receive telegrams. Short, impersonal notices marked "missing in action." The women who had once cheered parades now stood in silence at train stations, waiting for letters that would never come. And yet, for all the pain, for all the loss, Hitler refused to change course. He blamed his generals, his allies, the weather, anything but himself. He raged that Paulus had surrendered rather than taken his own life. He could have saved his honor, Hitler said bitterly, but instead he chose shame. But in truth, there was no honor left in Stalingrad, only survival and ruin. In the Kremlin, Stalin received the news with grim satisfaction. For him, Stalingrad was more than a victory. It was vindication. It proved that the Red Army could not only defend but destroy. It was the turning point of the entire war. Soviet propaganda celebrated the triumph with parades, posters, and speeches. But among the soldiers who had fought there, the mood was quieter. Many had lost everyone they knew. Some had fought so long in the ruins that they no longer remembered what normal life felt like. One soldier wrote home, "We won, but I feel no joy. I can only feel the silence." For Germany, the consequences of Stalingrad were catastrophic. The Wehrmacht had lost not just an army, but the illusion of control. Nearly 24 divisions had been destroyed or shattered. The loss of equipment, tanks, artillery, planes, was immense. But more devastating was the loss of faith. Generals who had once trusted Hitler began to question him in private. They saw the madness behind his commands, the obsession with holding ground at all costs, even when retreat could save lives. Stalingrad was no longer just a defeat, it was a warning of what was to come. In the months that followed, the Eastern Front began to unravel. The Soviets, emboldened by their victory, launched fresh offensives across the Don and into Ukraine. German lines buckled. The front that had once stretched confidently toward the Caucasus now collapsed in retreat. In occupied Europe, the news spread slowly but powerfully. In the cafes of Paris, the factories of Prague, in the streets of Warsaw, whispers grew. The Germans can be beaten. Resistance movements took courage. The iron wall of Nazi domination, once unbreakable, now had cracks. Meanwhile, in Germany itself, Goebbels made his most infamous speech. On February 18, 1943, in the Sportpalast of Berlin, he stood before a crowd and shouted, "Do you want total war?" The people roared in response, their voices trembling not with enthusiasm, but with desperation. It was the moment when Germany's war turned inward, when fear replaced triumph and survival replaced victory. The officer who had written his final letter from Stalingrad would never know any of this. His words, carried through the snow by Soviet hands, would become one of thousands of letters found on the bodies of the fallen. Some were kept by soldiers as souvenirs, others stored in archives where they remain to this day. They tell the same story, of courage, of confusion, of faith in a cause that was already doomed. One wrote, "We believed we were invincible. Now I only hope someone will remember us," and they were remembered, not as conquerors, but as the faces of a tragedy that revealed the cost of blind obedience. For the Red Army, Stalingrad was the beginning of the long road west. For Germany, it was the beginning of the long fall home. The world had changed. The front lines would shift again and again, but the balance of power would never return to what it had been before January 1943. From that moment on, every German advance was temporary, every victory hollow. In the ashes of Stalingrad, the war's outcome had already been written, not in ink, but in frost and fire. The officer's final letter ended with a promise. "Tell them I did my duty." But history would remember something larger. It would remember what Stalingrad revealed, that even the strongest armies can crumble when faith meets reality. The snow had buried the city. The river flowed again. But beneath the ice lay the memory of an empire's turning point, the moment when conquest froze and defeat began to thaw. The ruins of Stalingrad smoldered through the spring of 1943, their broken walls standing like gravestones over the dead. The battle was over, but the war was far from done. Across the frozen steppes, the German army retreated westward, disoriented, broken, and pursued. It was the first time since 1939 that German soldiers were marching away from their objectives. The long road that had once led toward victory now led only toward survival. For the men who had escaped Stalingrad, the front was no longer a place of pride, but of punishment. The collapse of the Sixth Army marked a shift in history, not only militarily, but psychologically. The aura that had surrounded the Wehrmacht, the legend of its invincibility, was gone. The officer's final letter, written in despair amid the ruins, was echoed in thousands of others. His words, "We are abandoned," reflected what many soldiers now felt, but dared not say aloud. In Berlin, Hitler's response was fury. He refused to accept the scale of the disaster. In his mind, Stalingrad was not the end of the campaign in the East, but a temporary setback. He sacked generals, accused commanders of cowardice, and demanded new offensives, as though the mere force of his will could reverse what had already been lost. But the truth could no longer be hidden. Across occupied Europe, whispers spread through the underground press. Even in neutral countries, the headlines told a story that Berlin could not censor. Germany's great army defeated on the Volga. For the first time, the tide of the war had turned, not only on the map, but in the minds of men. Meanwhile, the Red Army pushed onward. Its soldiers were exhausted, many wearing patched uniforms, their weapons rusted by the cold, yet they advanced. Stalin demanded more victories, more offensives, more proof that the Soviet Union could not only defend, but destroy. The German army, still vast but fractured, fell back toward the Donets Basin. Its officers tried to rebuild order among the chaos. Supply lines had broken. Thousands of wounded had been left behind in the retreat. Every village became a field hospital, every forest a graveyard. The Luftwaffe, once the hammer of German conquest, was now reduced to desperate supply runs, flying food and medicine to stranded pockets of troops before being driven off by Soviet fighters. In Germany, the home front began to feel the tremors of defeat. Factories worked day and night to replace what had been lost at Stalingrad. Tanks, trucks, rifles, uniforms. But resources were stretched thin. The promise of a short war had long since vanished. Families went hungry, cities shook beneath the thunder of Allied bombers, and yet propaganda carried on. The same newspapers that once called Stalingrad the gateway to victory now declared it a lesson in heroism. Posters appeared with slogans urging endurance, sacrifice, and faith in the Führer. Goebbels spoke of the iron will of the German people, but behind the words lay fear. Fear that the nation was beginning to doubt. In private, even officers at the front began to question what they were fighting for. Letters intercepted by censors reveal a quiet disillusionment, not rebellion, but resignation. "It will never end," one captain wrote. "We win nothing, we lose everything, and still we march." The Soviets, meanwhile, had discovered something they had long sought: confidence. For the first time, they were not only reacting to the enemy, they were dictating the pace of war. Their commanders, once cautious and inexperienced, had learned from their mistakes. They coordinated massive offensives with precision, using deception, artillery, and sheer numbers to overwhelm the enemy. But the victory at Stalingrad came at a cost that would shape the rest of the war. Millions were gone, entire families wiped out, cities flattened. The Soviet Union had survived, but barely. And now in that survival, there was something harder, colder, more determined. This was not the Red Army of 1941, disorganized and desperate. This was a force forged in suffering, led by men who understood that endurance itself was a weapon. In the summer of 1943, both sides prepared for the next great clash. Hitler, desperate to reclaim the initiative, planned a massive offensive at Kursk, a gamble to restore the myth of German superiority. Stalin, knowing the attack was coming, prepared his defenses in silence. The ghosts of Stalingrad still haunted both armies. For the Germans, it was the shadow of failure, a memory of hunger, cold, and betrayal that they could never escape. For the Soviets, it was a symbol of defiance, a reminder that they could withstand anything, even the most brutal storm of war. As the spring rains turned to summer heat, the stage was set for the next act of destruction. The letter from Stalingrad had been written and forgotten by those who found it, yet its words remained prophetic, a warning of what awaited anyone who mistook belief for truth. The men who survived Stalingrad would soon be sent to fight again, this time in the fields of Kursk. Few would return. The war, which had begun with laughter and confidence, had now become a slow, grinding struggle of exhaustion. The dreams of empire had turned to the reality of attrition. The officer's letter ended in the ruins of Stalingrad, but the world it described was only beginning to unravel. The snow had melted, the front had shifted, but the same question haunted both sides. How much could a nation lose before it ceased to believe in victory? By the summer of 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had entered a new phase, one shaped by exhaustion, vengeance, and the ghosts of Stalingrad. Both sides were rebuilding, both were preparing, and both understood that the next battle would determine the fate of the continent. For Germany, the defeat at Stalingrad had shattered more than an army. It had broken an illusion. Yet within the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia, denial had become doctrine. Hitler refused to see weakness. He demanded one more victory, something so decisive that it would erase the memory of the Volga disaster and restore his image as an infallible commander. He called it Operation Citadel. The plan was audacious, a massive pincer attack aimed at the Soviet salient around the city of Kursk. From north and south, German forces would converge, encircling and annihilating the Red Army formations within. It was meant to be the revenge for Stalingrad, a blow so devastating that it would cripple Soviet resistance once and for all. But unlike the early days of the war, the Soviets now saw it coming. Their intelligence, aided by intercepted communications and partisan networks, had revealed nearly every detail of the German plan. Stalin, advised by Zhukov, decided to wait. Rather than strike first, they would let the Germans come and then crush them in prepared defenses. For weeks, Soviet soldiers and civilians worked day and night. They dug trenches, laid millions of mines, and constructed layers of fortifications stretching hundreds of kilometers deep. When the German tanks arrived, they would face a fortress built from earth, steel, and determination. Meanwhile, in Germany, production reached its fever pitch. The new Tiger and Panther tanks, symbols of technological superiority, were assembled for the offensive. Hitler boasted that these machines would restore the fear of the German name, but behind the propaganda lay uncertainty. The generals knew that these new tanks were untested in large numbers and prone to mechanical failure. Still, the order was given. Kursk would be the redemption of the Reich. On July 5, 1943, at dawn, the silence broke. Thousands of German guns opened fire simultaneously. The horizon lit up like dawn itself. Columns of panzers, the largest armored force ever assembled by Germany, began their advance across the rolling steppe. Dust and smoke filled the sky. But as they moved forward, the minefields erupted. Tanks burned before they reached the first defensive line. Soviet artillery responded in waves, the earth shaking beneath the barrage. The air was filled with shrapnel, dust, and fire. The Battle of Kursk had begun, the largest tank battle in history, and the moment when the tide of war would turn forever. The German advance was relentless but slow. Each kilometer cost them men, fuel, and machines. Their tanks, though powerful, bogged down in mud and craters. The Soviet defenses were deeper and stronger than anyone had imagined. In the south, near Prokhorovka, the fighting reached its climax. On July 12th, two massive armored formations collided head-on. Over 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns in a single field. The sound was deafening, like thunder rolling without end. Soviet T-34s charged directly into the German lines, closing the distance so that the longer-range German guns could not aim properly. The battlefield became a whirlwind of smoke, fire, and steel. Tanks collided, turrets flew through the air, and men fought hand-to-hand amid burning wrecks. When the smoke cleared, the fields were black with ash and twisted metal. Hundreds of tanks lay burning. The Germans had advanced only a few kilometers. Their offensive was spent. To the west, another disaster loomed. The Allies had landed in Sicily, opening a new front against Hitler's empire. Reinforcements were pulled from the Eastern Front, and Operation Citadel, Germany's last great offensive in the East, was over. The irony was cruel. The very offensive meant to erase the humiliation of Stalingrad had instead confirmed it. For the men who fought at Kursk, the scale of destruction was beyond imagination. A German survivor later wrote, "Everywhere there was smoke, everywhere there was death. We believed in machines more than men, and the machines burned with us." The Soviets, though victorious, paid an enormous price. Tens of thousands were dead or wounded, but they had done what no army had achieved before. They had stopped the German war machine cold and broken its ability to attack. After Kursk, the initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Red Army. The Germans would never again launch a major offensive in the East. From that moment on, the war would be fought on their soil, under skies filled with the same smoke they had once cast over others. The echoes of Stalingrad were still present, in the silence of the prisoners, in the letters that never reached home, and in the hollow eyes of men who now understood that victory was slipping away. As the Red Army pushed forward through the ruins of summer, one truth became clear. The war that began with German laughter was ending in German silence. But even as the Soviets advanced, another front was awakening in the West. Across the English Channel, Allied commanders were preparing for a second front, one that would strike at the heart of occupied Europe. The Germans did not yet know it, but their nightmare was only half over. The soldiers who had fallen at Stalingrad would not see it, but their defeat had set the course of history, a course that now led, inexorably, to Berlin. The year was 1944. The Third Reich still controlled much of Europe, but its empire was cracking. In the East, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly, retaking cities once thought lost forever. In the skies over Germany, Allied bombers turned day into fire. And across the Channel, an armada was gathering, a storm the German officers refused to believe would ever come. Since 1940, the German military had ruled Western Europe with confidence. They had conquered France in 6 weeks, humiliated Britain at Dunkirk, and watched the United States enter the war with skepticism. To them, the Americans were amateurs, soft, untested, and far from the disciplined standards of the Wehrmacht. In Berlin, German generals laughed at the idea that American soldiers could match them on the battlefield. They saw the United States as a factory, not a fighting nation. a country of businessmen, not warriors. But by 1944, that arrogance was beginning to tremble. In the offices of the German High Command, whispers spread of an Allied invasion. The question was not if, but where. France was heavily fortified along the Atlantic coast. Hitler's so-called Atlantic Wall, a vast network of bunkers, artillery, and minefields stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. The Germans expected an attack at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. Every piece of intelligence seemed to point there. But across the Channel, the Allies were preparing for something much bolder. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. For months, the Allies built the greatest invasion force in history. Over 150,000 men, 7,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft were gathered in southern England. To deceive the Germans, a massive campaign of misinformation was launched. Fake radio traffic, dummy armies made of inflatable tanks, and double agents feeding false reports to Berlin. It worked. Hitler and his generals were convinced the main attack would come at Calais. When the real invasion began, their attention and their reserve were in the wrong place. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the sky above the English Channel turned gray. It began with the distant hum of engines, thousands of them. Allied bombers and transport planes filled the air. Paratroopers leapt into darkness behind enemy lines, their parachutes opening like pale ghosts against the clouds. Their mission? To cut roads, seize bridges, and sow confusion before the main landings began. Then as the first light broke, the horizon filled with ships. From horizon to horizon, the sea was alive. Destroyers, transports, landing craft, battleships. The invasion had begun. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave hit the beaches of Normandy. The Americans landed at Utah and Omaha. The British struck at Golden Sword, the Canadians at Juneau. The sea churned with smoke, steel, and men. German bunkers opened fire, turning the beaches into hell. On Omaha Beach, the resistance was fiercest. The tide had carried the landing craft off course, leaving soldiers exposed to open fire. Machine guns swept the sand. Artillery shells tore through the waves. For hours, chaos reigned. One survivor would later recall, "Men were cut down before they even touched the water." The sea ran red, but still, they went forward. The German defenders believed they had repelled the invasion. Reports to headquarters spoke of Allied failure, of men trapped and drowning. But then, amid the smoke and the surf, the Americans began to push forward. They climbed the cliffs using ropes, bayonets, even their bare hands. Engineers cleared mines. Medics pulled the wounded from the water. Slowly, inch by inch, the tide turned. By noon, beachheads were secured. By nightfall, over 130,000 Allied troops had landed in France. The impossible had been done. In Berlin, disbelief turned to rage. Hitler accused his generals of incompetence. He refused to release armored divisions stationed near Calais, still convinced the invasion was a feint. Days passed before he realized the truth. And by then, it was too late. The laughter that had once echoed through German headquarters was gone. The officers who had mocked the Americans were now staring at reports of an unstoppable advance. Within weeks, Allied forces pushed inland, breaking through the hedgerows of Normandy. Towns like Caen, Saint-Lô, and Corentin became battlefields, scenes of courage and devastation. The German defenders fought fiercely, but they were overwhelmed by sheer force of numbers and firepower. The same officers who had dismissed the Americans as amateurs now faced an enemy that fought with precision, speed, and endurance. The U.S. Sherman tanks were not the most powerful, but they came in endless waves. The artillery fire was relentless. The air above the battlefield belonged to the Allies. Every German movement was shadowed by fighter bombers. For the first time since 1939, the Wehrmacht was on the defensive in the West. And yet the war was far from over. The battle for Normandy would drag on for weeks, through the mud and hedges of the French countryside. The Allies had landed, but they had yet to break out. Hitler, desperate and furious, saw one final chance to throw them back into the sea. He would order a counterattack, a gamble that might restore his pride or destroy what remained of his army in France. The decision would lead to one of the most brutal and decisive battles of the campaign. a confrontation that would seal the fate of Germany's Western Front. July 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy had become a maze of death. The Germans fought from every field and farm, using the terrain like a fortress. The Allies, though stronger, struggled to advance. Every mile of ground was paid for with lives. But behind the chaos, a shift was happening, one that would break the last illusion of German control in the West. For 6 weeks after D-Day, the German army held the Allies near the coast. Towns like Caen and Saint-Lô were reduced to rubble. Hitler had ordered his commanders to hold every inch of ground, to never retreat. His generals obeyed, but at a cost. The Wehrmacht, once famed for its mobility, was being bled dry. The Allies, meanwhile, grew stronger. Their supply lines stretched back across the Channel, endless ships bringing food, fuel, ammunition, and men. Every day, more divisions landed. Every day, the skies filled with Allied planes. For the Germans, the air itself had become the enemy. Allied fighters ruled the skies from dawn to dusk. Convoys were destroyed, bridges bombed, railways shattered. Soldiers moved only at night, hiding under trees by day. The laughter that had once filled German mess tents was gone, replaced by the drone of aircraft overhead. In late July, the Allies prepared their breakout. The plan was called Operation Cobra. After weeks of brutal fighting, American forces under General Omar Bradley would unleash a concentrated assault designed to smash the German lines south of Saint-Lô. At dawn on July 25, 1944, the sky itself opened. Thousands of Allied bombers roared overhead, dropping their payloads on a narrow strip of front. The explosions rolled like thunder across Normandy. Entire German positions disappeared beneath clouds of fire and dust. When the smoke cleared, the American tanks moved in. The front, so static for weeks, finally broke. The Germans tried to counterattack, but their communications were shattered, their units scattered, their air support gone. For the first time, the Americans advanced not by inches but by miles. Villages that had held out for weeks fell in hours. The German generals were stunned. They had underestimated the Americans, believing them cautious, dependent on machines and planning. But what they now faced was something else entirely. Relentless, disciplined, and unyielding. By the first week of August, the Allies had broken through. The German front collapsed. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge tried to restore order, but it was impossible. Hitler's orders forbade withdrawal. The result was catastrophe. Outside the town of Falaise, the German army found itself trapped. Nearly 50,000 men surrounded by Allied forces. It became known as the Falaise Pocket, one of the most devastating encirclements of the Western Front. For days, the Germans tried to break free. Columns of tanks and trucks raced through smoke-filled valleys under relentless Allied air attacks. The roads became clogged with wreckage and the remains of retreat. It was chaos, the kind of collapse the Wehrmacht had once inflicted on others. By mid-August, the trap closed. Thousands were captured. The once proud German 7th Army was annihilated. The fields of Normandy, where they had once stood confident and defiant, were now littered with silence. The officers who had once laughed at the Americans were either dead, captured, or fleeing east. The truth was undeniable. The U.S. Army in less than 3 months had done what even the most optimistic generals in Berlin had thought impossible. They had not only landed, they had destroyed the German front in France. Paris was next. In late August, French resistance fighters rose up within the city. The German garrison, worn and leaderless, struggled to maintain control. Hitler ordered Paris destroyed, but his commanders defied him. On August 25, 1944, Allied forces entered the capital. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, crying, embracing soldiers as liberators. Church bells rang for the first time in years. For the Germans, it was humiliation. The capital they had paraded through in triumph 4 years earlier was lost. The laughter of 1940, the arrogance that had filled the halls of Berlin, had turned to bitter silence. But even in defeat, the war was not over. Hitler refused to surrender. He told his generals that one final counterstrike could turn the tide. The Allies had advanced too far, too fast, he claimed. Their supply lines were stretched. Their morale was fragile. If Germany could deliver one crushing blow in the West, perhaps the war could still be saved. It was madness, but the generals obeyed. In the forests of Western Germany, they began preparing for one last gamble. It would be Hitler's final illusion of victory, a desperate strike that would come to define the winter of 1944. A battle born of denial, fought in snow and fog, where once again German officers believed they could break the Americans. But this time, history would not repeat itself. December 1944. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but few on the ground could feel it. The Allies had liberated France, crossed Belgium, and now stood poised along the German border. Many believed the enemy was finished, its armies broken, its morale destroyed. But deep within the forests of Western Germany, the Germans were preparing something unexpected. One final strike, one last attempt to turn defeat into victory. Hitler called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. His plan was as audacious as it was desperate, to launch a surprise attack through the Ardennes, the same dense forest through which his armies had stormed in 1940. The goal was to split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate peace on his terms. Most of his generals knew it was impossible. The Wehrmacht no longer had the strength of 1940. Its tanks were few, its fuel was scarce, and its air force was crippled. But Hitler, now surrounded by loyalists and illusions, refused to see reality. The Americans, he declared, are soft. They will break that belief. That arrogance would lead to the last great battle of the Western Front, the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes was shattered. In the early morning fog, more than 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks surged forward under the cover of darkness. Artillery fire echoed through the hills. American outposts, caught by surprise, were engulfed before dawn. The snow fell thick, muffling sound and sight alike. The Germans advanced fast, disguised in captured Allied uniforms, cutting communication lines and sowing confusion. Within hours, the once stable front began to bend, and then to break. For the first time since Normandy, the Americans were in retreat. In Bastogne, a small Belgian town at the crossroads of vital highways, a single U.S. division, the 101st Airborne, found itself surrounded. German forces closed in from all sides, demanding surrender. The American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a single-word reply that would become legend: nuts. The siege of Bastogne began. Through freezing nights and blizzards, the paratroopers held their ground. Food ran low. Ammunition dwindled. The wounded lay in cellars, their breath turning to frost. German loudspeakers blared propaganda into the snow, promising annihilation. But still, the Americans refused to yield. They fought not for glory, but for endurance. Meanwhile, elsewhere along the front, chaos reigned. The Germans pressed on, driving deep into the Allied lines, creating a massive bulge that gave the battle its name. For a few brief days, Hitler's gamble seemed to work. His armored spearheads reached within 100 kilometers of the Meuse River. The Allies were stunned. But beneath the illusion of success, disaster was already forming. Fuel shortages crippled the German advance. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was powerless to protect the columns from Allied aircraft. And once the skies cleared, the tide turned. On December 23rd, the weather broke. The clouds lifted, revealing the battlefield below. Allied planes returned in force. Fighters and bombers filled the sky, striking at German tanks, trucks, and convoys. Roads became graveyards of steel. The Americans counterattacked. Patton's Third Army, moving with astonishing speed through snow and ice, turned north to relieve Bastogne. By Christmas, his tanks reached the surrounded paratroopers. The defenders had held. The German offensive, once so daring, began to collapse. In January 1945, the Allies regained everything they had lost. What Hitler had hoped would divide the Western Front instead destroyed what remained of his reserves. The last German tanks burned in the snow, the last soldiers retreating on foot toward the Rhine. For those who survived, the irony was bitter. The officers who had once mocked the Americans as weak had seen them stand firm in the worst of winter, outfight, outlast, and overcome. The laughter of 1940 was gone, replaced by disbelief. By February, the Allies stood once more on the banks of the Rhine River. The German heartland lay open. From the east, the Red Army was closing in, driving through Poland toward Berlin. From the west, the British, Canadians, and Americans prepared to cross into the Reich itself. The war that had begun with arrogance was now ending in silence. The generals who had once believed in the myth of German invincibility could no longer deny the truth. The Americans, whom they had mocked for their inexperience, had proven themselves relentless. Their factories never stopped, their armies never broke, their will never faltered, and soon they would meet the Soviets in the ruins of Germany. The final act of the war was about to begin. The fall of the Reich, the collapse of its armies, and the reckoning of a generation that had believed the world would kneel before them. But before that end, the Allies would uncover something even darker than the battlefields, a truth that would redefine the very meaning of victory. Spring 1945, the thunder of war rolled across Germany for the final time. From east and west, two vast armies closed in, the Red Army and the Western Allies. Between them lay a nation in ruins, its cities reduced to ash, its armies shattered, and its people fleeing from a future they could no longer imagine. The Allies crossed the Rhine in March. For the first time since the beginning of the war, foreign soldiers marched on German soil. Towns that had once celebrated victory now burned in silence. The roads were filled with refugees, families pushing carts, soldiers limping home, officers staring at maps that no longer mattered. The German command structure was collapsing. Orders no longer meant obedience, only delay. The once disciplined Wehrmacht was disintegrating under the weight of hopelessness. And yet, even as everything fell apart, Hitler refused to surrender. From his bunker beneath Berlin, he raged against the inevitable. He issued commands to imaginary divisions, demanded counterattacks that could no longer be made, and blamed his generals for his own failures. He still spoke of victory, even as the walls of his capital shook with artillery. The Allies, meanwhile, advanced rapidly across Western Germany. General Eisenhower's armies captured city after city: Cologne, Frankfurt, Kassel. Bridges were seized intact, rivers crossed under fire. In less than a month, the American and British forces had achieved what once seemed impossible: the complete collapse of the Western Front. Everywhere they went, they found the same sight: rubble, starvation, surrender. But as the front moved deeper into Germany, a new reality began to emerge, one darker than any battlefield. In early April, Allied patrols stumbled upon something they could hardly comprehend: the first concentration camps. At Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, American soldiers entered a place beyond imagination. The air was heavy with the smell of death. Emaciated prisoners stumbled toward their liberators, some crying, some too weak to stand. General Eisenhower himself visited the camp. What he saw left him speechless. He ordered that every possible witness, soldiers, journalists, and local German civilians, see the camps firsthand. Lest, he said, the world ever forget what happened here. One camp became many: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The names spread like wounds across the map. The soldiers who had fought through mud, snow, and fire now faced something worse: the evidence of what the war had truly been about. The arrogance that had led to conquest had ended in atrocity. As word spread, a grim clarity settled over the Allied ranks. This was no longer just a war of armies. It was a war for humanity itself, and it had to end, no matter the cost. In mid-April, the Red Army entered the outskirts of Berlin. The Western Allies stopped along the Elbe River, as agreed. The final prize, the German capital, would go to the Soviets. But for the Americans, there was no victory march. There was only exhaustion. The soldiers who had landed in Normandy less than a year earlier were now veterans of a continent's liberation. They had fought through hedgerows, rivers, forests, and cities, and finally they stood at the heart of the enemy's homeland. But what they saw was not triumph. It was desolation. Factories lay silent, fields burned, villages were filled with widows and children. The mighty Reich that had promised 1,000 years had not survived 12. For many German officers, the end came not with glory, but with resignation. Some surrendered quietly, relieved it was finally over. Others took their own lives, unwilling to face the shame of defeat. The same men who had once mocked the Americans as amateurs now faced them as conquerors. Young soldiers who had crossed oceans, fought through Europe, and never stopped coming. On April 25, 1945, Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe River near Torgau. East met West in a moment of quiet awe. They shook hands on a shattered bridge, surrounded by wreckage and silence. The war in Europe was almost over, but the cost had been unimaginable. Tens of millions dead, cities erased, a generation scarred forever. The laughter that had filled German headquarters in 1940, the laughter of officers who believed they could conquer the world, had turned to silence by 1945. And in that silence lay the true measure of defeat. Not just the fall of an army, but the collapse of an idea. That power could replace conscience, and arrogance could defy history. The Americans, once dismissed as inexperienced and naive, had become the architects of liberation. They had fought not for empire, but for an end, for the day when the guns would finally go quiet. As April turned to May, Berlin was burning, Hitler was gone, and the world was ready to breathe again. But the shadow of what had been revealed would never fade. May 1945. The war that had begun with thunder ended in silence. Across Europe, the guns stopped firing, the skies cleared of bombers, and the echoes of 6 years of destruction faded into the wind. The Reich that had once promised domination lay in ruins, its cities shattered, its leaders dead or captured, its people facing a reckoning beyond imagination. In Berlin, Soviet soldiers raised the red banner over the Reichstag. The city that had once been the beating heart of Hitler's empire was now a wasteland of rubble and smoke. The streets were littered with wrecked vehicles, collapsed buildings, and the ashes of what had once been ambition. The last German officers who had commanded here were gone. Some fled, some surrendered, some ended their own lives rather than face capture. The once mighty Wehrmacht, the army that had swept across Europe in 1940 and mocked the Americans as untested and soft, no longer existed. Its divisions were gone. Its generals were prisoners. The laughter that had echoed through mess halls in Paris and Warsaw had died in the mud of Normandy, the snow of the Ardennes, and the ruins of Berlin. The Americans, meanwhile, stood among the ruins as both victors and witnesses. Their journey, from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, had changed them. They had come as soldiers of democracy, uncertain of their place in a world consumed by totalitarianism. They left as liberators. They had seen too much to celebrate without sorrow. The war had taught them not only about courage and sacrifice, but about the darkness humanity could descend into. When they marched through the gates of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen, they realized the war had never truly been about land or politics. It had been about conscience, about what happens when hatred and arrogance replace humanity. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the news spread across the world. The fighting was over. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds filled the streets. Flags waved, bells rang, and people wept with joy. But for the soldiers standing in the rubble of Germany, the feeling was quieter. A mixture of relief, disbelief, and exhaustion. For many, it was impossible to celebrate without thinking of the cost. More than 400,000 Americans had been killed. Countless more were wounded in body and mind. Across Europe, tens of millions were dead. The war had left scars that would take generations to heal. But amid the ruin, something extraordinary had been proven. That democracy, though slow to act and often underestimated, could endure the test of total war. That free nations, when united by purpose, could stand against tyranny and win. The German officers who had once laughed at the Americans, who had mocked them as soldiers unprepared for real war, had vanished into history. They had underestimated not only American strength, but American will. When the U.S. Army landed in North Africa, they called it a rehearsal. When they landed in Sicily, they called it a beginning. When they landed in Normandy, they called it impossible. But they did it, step by step, mile by mile, until the Reich itself collapsed before them. From the beaches of Omaha and Utah to the forests of the Ardennes, from the frozen fields of Belgium to the shattered bridges of the Rhine, the Americans learned what it meant to fight a war they never wanted, for a world they refused to lose. They crossed oceans not to conquer, but to restore. They fought not for empire, but for peace. And when it was over, they walked away. They helped rebuild the very continent that had once mocked them, feeding its people, rebuilding its cities, and laying the foundations for a peace that would last for generations. That act, perhaps more than any victory on the battlefield, became the true measure of their strength. Germany too would be rebuilt. Out of the ruins came reflection. Out of reflection came responsibility. The laughter that had once been born of arrogance was replaced by humility, a recognition of what had been lost and what could never be repeated. For Europe, 1945 was not an ending, but a beginning, a fragile dawn after a night that had seemed endless. History remembers battles and victories, but what endures are the lessons written in their ashes. The German officers had laughed at the Americans once, at their optimism, their inexperience, their belief in freedom. But in the end, it was that belief that carried them across the Atlantic, across the beaches, across the ruins, to victory. The laughter faded, the arrogance died, and from the silence that followed, a new world began to rise. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.